Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Clery Compliance Challenges Alerting. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Associate Executive Director of Programs for the Clery Center for Security on Campus, and I'm going to moderate today's webinar. I'm first going to review a few housekeeping items before we get started. We encourage you to interact with us by typing in questions and comments using the questions pane in your control panel. We will also have times throughout the webinar where we will ask you to share your thoughts on certain topic areas. We'll record today's webinar and it will be provided to you in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email. If you've not yet had the opportunity to sign up to participate in this year's campaign, you can do so by clicking on the link in the control panel. As a reminder, this year we've reinvented last year's Know More, Do More campaign to connect institutions with information and resources at no cost to them. Individuals that sign up for the campaign have access to numerous resources that are divided into Know More resources that increase knowledge in specific topic areas, as well as Do More resources that turn that knowledge into action through policy evaluation, programs, or other action steps. Just to give you a sense of the flow of today's webinar, we're going to start with our panelist discussion and leave time at the end for question and answers. Again, please feel free to use the questions pane to share your questions and comments throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many as possible during our time together. I'm also so thrilled that today's panelists were able to join us, and I'll share a little bit about each panelist before we get started. Anton Altman serves as the Clery Program Assistant Director at the University of Wisconsin Police Department. In this role, Altman shares responsibility for the institution's annual security report, Campus Security Authority identification and training, timely warnings and emergency notifications, the Clery Crime and Fire Log, as well as the intersection between the Clery Act and Title IX. Blaine Nickerson serves as the Assistant Vice President of Campus Relations and Chief of Staff for the Auraria Higher Education Center. In his current role, Nickerson helps to oversee the daily operations of the campus and its wide variety of service-oriented units and departments. He serves as the agency budget director, managing a combined revenue and expense budget of over $130 million annually. Nickerson also directly supervises the campus police department, emergency preparedness, early learning center, human resources and equal opportunity, information technology and telecommunications, as well as serving as the campus's public information officer for both routine and emergency communications, which certainly relates to today's topic. Today's webinar is focused on specific reporting requirements under the Clery Act. As you know, the Clery Act is a landmark federal law that requires colleges and universities to share statistics about specific crimes that occur within the campus community, as well as have certain campus safety and security policies and procedures. These requirements are not just annual requirements, but also ongoing reporting requirements, which is some of the focus for today's webinar. This webinar will focus on two specific elements of Clery Act reporting, which is emergency notifications and timely warnings. The Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, which we're going to link in that control panel as well, has a one-page comparison of the differences between the two requirements, which is provided as one of the handouts under the Handouts tab of your control panel. So if you've not had a chance, I know that the webinar slides were emailed to you prior to the webinar, but if you didn't have a chance to access them or you'd like to take a look at some of the other handouts that we're providing for reference during the webinar, you can go into the handouts drop down on your control panel and you'll be able to click on those and access all of those during our session today. I'm also going to do a quick review of these requirements and some things to think about, and then we're just going to dive into our discussion. So Clery Act reporting, as you know, is tied to specific crimes: homicide, sex offenses, robbery, aggravated assaults, burglary, motor vehicle thefts, arson, arrests and referrals for alcohol, drug, and weapons law violations and hate crimes, as well as the recent additions of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. When one of these crimes occurs within specific geography outlined by the Clery Act, colleges and universities must make a case-by-case determination as to whether the crime represents a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. So that's to give some context for those of us on the webinar. I know that when you registered for the webinar, we had a wide range of background and knowledge around timely warnings and emergency notification. So if the campus makes the determination that that information must be sent to the campus community, and if they determine that a serious or ongoing threat is present, they must send out a timely warning that includes information that would promote safety and aid in the prevention of similar crimes within that campus community. Emergency notifications, as you see on the list over here, are a little bit broader. If there is confirmation of a significant emergency or dangerous situation involving an immediate threat to the health or safety of students or employees on campus, which could include things like an earthquake or a gas leak, then the institution must immediately notify the campus community of the threat. So I don't want to spend too much time on background because I want to make sure that we have a lot of time for discussion about some of the specifics around this. But as I mentioned, one of the handouts that's in your control panel has a really good overview about the relation of timely warnings to emergency notification and what some of those differences are. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, and certainly the chapter related to timely warnings and emergency notification within the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. The Department of Education enforces the Clery Act, and some of the things that we're seeing around timely warnings and emergency notification, and one of the reasons that we included this particular area in our Compliance Challenges webinar series is because program reviews have highlighted gaps in how institutions address timely warning and emergency notification. And if you notice some of the examples that we used, and we do this not to create concern around a program review, but really to use that as information that might inform some of the work that you do on your own campus, we see that in some of those reviews there are challenges in terms of drafting the policies themselves, but then also there were gaps in reflecting these policies within the annual security report and in executing the sharing of information with the campus community. So as part of a program that we have at the Clery Center, our collaborative program, which is a learning membership program, we work with institutions to do annual security report reviews, and this is one of the common areas that we're seeing working with not just members, but in our trainings that we do across the country, we're seeing a lot of institutions that may have some overlap in the way that they're describing their timely warnings versus emergency notification, where they may not have separate policies or procedures, or more often what we're seeing is that they may have some really great policies, but they're not adequately reflecting that within their annual security report. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is really who should be at the table when we're drafting those policies, what are some things that we should think about, and how can we effectively communicate these details to our campus community. So although our online and our in-person trainings are certainly more in-depth than the next hour will be, this webinar is really intended to get you thinking more carefully about your own process for drafting policies and how you implement these requirements on your own campuses. So one of the things that I mentioned is that we're going to talk a little bit about who's at the table when we're drafting timely warning and emergency notification policies. But before we hear from our panelists today, we also just wanted to get a sense from all of you as to what that looks like at your particular institution. So what I'd like you to do is to go into the chat section of your control panel, and I'd like you to jot in that space who's at the table when you're drafting timely warning policies, when you're drafting emergency notification policies. For some of you, you may not play that role on your campus, so it's perfectly acceptable to communicate that in the chat box, that is something that you're not involved in. But for those of you who are, which it seemed like many of you were, given some of the questions that we asked initially when you were registering for this webinar, we just like to get a picture of who is involved in that process on your campus. Okay, so I see Campus Security and Safety Committee, which has representation from various departments across the college, so really looking at a multidisciplinary approach, which is always exciting to see. We have Senior Administration, Director of University Communications, Compliance Office. We have others that are saying different departments like Student Life, Public Safety, VP for Facilities, Public Safety, Legal, Emergency Management. So we're seeing a number of different departments, Judicial Affairs. So many of you are listing multidisciplinary teams that are involved in creating these policies. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all involved in the case-by-case decision making, and we're going to talk about that a little bit further. But it's really exciting to look and to see that a lot of you really have a number of different departments that play a role in crafting language or in putting these policies in place. And we're going to see just through our conversation today why that might be so important. So as we mentioned in the overview, policy statements in the annual security report need to reflect actual policies on the campus. So I'm going to start with Anton. And Anton, can you share a little bit about what that process looked like for you? We heard from a lot of individuals attending this webinar that they had a multidisciplinary approach. What did that mean for your campus?
At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we drew a group of organizational representatives, including representatives from University Legal, University Housing, the Campus Police Department, the Dean of Students Office, our Title IX coordinator, and a variety of other offices that, Abby, you mentioned, that our participants also mentioned. And I think that serves kind of a variable purpose. One is that it informs especially senior administrators as to what is going on, why timely warnings exist, and why timely warnings will be issued. Because, of course, at universities, especially the University of Wisconsin, our timely warnings go out to upwards of 90,000 people. So when we have a wide distribution like that, a lot of people on campus are very interested as to why, in particular, a certain timely warning is issued. And this conversation should start when the policy is being drafted and not after, when typically we see questions and blowback from administrators and students and faculty members and staff members that don't understand why such a notice needs to be issued. So that's a very important thing to do, to develop a kind of multidisciplinary committee, which also starts a conversation going about developing a Clery Act committee and generally on campus, both at the leadership level and at the working level. So we started that conversation with those numbers of people that I previously mentioned across campus, and it ended up with a decision that the University Police Department would be issuing the warnings, that a senior supervisor would have the power to determine whether or not a threat was serious and ongoing.
Great. So it sounds like there was kind of a really intentional process of bringing a number of different people together and getting the buy-in from multiple different people on your campus, which really reinforces what a lot of the participants are saying as well, that their process doesn't just involve, traditionally who you would think of as being involved in sending an alert or warning, which would be campus safety or security, but other members as well, and getting that buy-in. Blaine, can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like for you in terms of policy development and who was at the table for yours?
Sure, and I think that the goal of any policy development that you do is to try to get that buy-in at different levels of the institution. So that there is comfort that when you've made these decisions about when you send out or something wasn't sent out, that there was some rationale behind that. Having those discussions ahead of time, just like Anton said, is critically important. And, having a well-developed policy and practice that's justifiable can help you out in a lot of situations. Because just like Anton mentioned, when you have a consumer audience that is accustomed to receiving timely information when a crime has occurred within your Clery geography, they generally have expectations that they're going to be notified about almost everything. And so we tend to get questions from people about, well, we know that this crime occurred, but how come I didn't get a timely warning about it? And I'll give you an example just from last week here on my own campus. We're a very busy urban campus right in the middle of downtown Denver with 2 light rail lines that come onto the campus. And we had a robbery that was taking place on one of the light rail trains as it came to sort of the public station at the edge of campus. Long story short, the robber or the suspect in that incident had a gun and was actually disarmed by the purported victims, who managed to then shoot the robber. And I won't go into all the details about it, but he did get shot in the rear end. And so what happened here and what we were left with was a lot of media reporting that was saying shooting at the Auraria campus, or one injured by shooting at the Auraria campus. What the media wasn't necessarily reporting was the fact that any of the suspects or involved parties were immediately taken into custody. And so in that case, we no longer have that ongoing and continuing threat, which negates the need for a timely warning. And when you have good policies in place, you're able to point to those when people whether it be individuals on your campus or media, when they ask questions about why wasn't there a timely warning, those can sometimes be just as useful to have those policies to back you up.
I think that's a really fantastic point, Blaine, and it kind of speaks to the fact, and this comes up quite a bit in a lot of the trainings that we do, is that when we're talking about timely warning and emergency notification, the reason that that information is out there is because we want to help increase the safety and security of the campus community. So it's a need to know because it's representing a serious or ongoing threat. It's not a need to know just because the campus is interested or wants to know information. And we see this especially in cases around campus sexual assault in particular, where there may sometimes be members of the community that are saying we should have known about this particular incident, and it's more around interest or curiosity than it is around the safety of the campus community. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically later on in the webinar around those types of cases and how we make that case-by-case determination related to campus sexual assault. But I really appreciated you kind of noting that, Blaine, that the goal here is really to recognize, is there a serious or ongoing threat? And if so, to be able to share that information with the campus community. So a couple of key takeaways from what was just shared. One is that consideration of who is at the table. There are a number of different people or groups that were named both by participants within the webinar, but then also by our panelists. Only your institution really knows what that process should look like, but it's something to take a moment and consider, are there other people that are involved in this policy development? We're going to be talking a little bit more deeply about the content within these warnings or within notification. So it'll be helpful to think about who on your campus has knowledge or expertise that might inform the creation of these policies, even if they're not always involved in the day-to-day. We also put this statement, say what you do and do what you say, which is directly pulled from the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, and it speaks to Blaine's point about the fact that you want to have policies in place that you can look to and point to. So if there's ever a question of, well, why didn't you send out a warning, why didn't you send out an alert in this particular situation, those policies really concretely explain, well, here are the reasons why we may send information to our campus community, why we find it important, and when you can expect that from us, so that you'll be able to be confident in the decisions that you make. I will say that that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we see in working with institutions, is certainly not a lack of expertise, because we see so much of it as we're working with campuses across the country. But what we do see in many situations is a lack of confidence in that expertise and in the decisions that they're making. So having strong policies that were really intentional in nature can really help to support that. So lastly, your policy guides your practice. So you want to make sure that you're bringing all of those folks to the table for a reason, because once you make this determination, once you're putting this policy in writing, that is your guidebook, so to speak, your playbook on how are we making decisions on our particular campus. So when you do that, you want to consider, are we, when we're looking at disseminating this information, when we're looking at who's going to send this information, are we making some sound decisions in terms of who those responsibilities fall into? So that moves on to our next question that we'd like you to answer, again, and using that chat function, is think about your particular campus. Let's just start with the first question, not the second one, and I'll share some of the answers that we see in the chat pane. Who on your campus is responsible for disseminating a timely warning? So if you're thinking specifically of your timely warning policy, what individual, what department, who is sending that information to the campus community? And I'll also note, I appreciate a lot of the comments that I'm seeing coming in. I see some of you saying things like, I'm not sure that we have a policy for timely warnings for emergency notification, which may be the case. Every campus is at a different point with making sure that they have everything that they need to in terms of Clery. So this might be a really good opportunity to consider what else you might need to put in place, whether or not you have a policy in place on your campus. And one resource that we have available on the National Campus Safety Awareness Month website that might be useful for these purposes is we have a checklist that looks at timely warnings and emergency notification and what you must have within your policies, and then your policy statements within your annual security report. So if you haven't signed up for National Campus Safety Awareness Month yet, like I said, it's all free resources, so that would be a good resource to be able to utilize for that purpose. So when we're looking at who's responsible for sending it out, we have a wider range. Should we have campus safety and security, so specific individuals I see listed from that department, the dean of students, student services director, campus president, student life, and student affairs. So you'll notice a compliance office. Some of you have public relations or a director of communications. So there's quite a wide array in terms of what we're seeing reflected in the answers here and who plays that role on the campus. And I know our panelists are going to speak to that a little bit further. But in the meantime, let's move on to that second question, which is who on your campus is responsible for disseminating an emergency notification? So just take a moment and see. I know that we looked at timely warning. What we're interested to see is if there are any differences in terms of emergency notification, if your process is any different. So in that chat function, put who on the campus is responsible for disseminating emergency notification. So we're seeing emergency manager, public safety in concert with communications and marketing, the Department of Public Safety, the president for some of you. We have campus police, and then we have a couple of people saying, well, I don't know who disseminates that on our campus. I'm not sure if we have a policy or we may not have a formal structure for sharing information. So I saw some of you say, I know that we share warnings with the community, but I'm not necessarily sure whether or not they're timely warnings or emergency notification. So looks like there may be a couple of action items or steps to take or to consider to make sure that you have these policies and that you have a process on your campus that you can follow through with. So let's consider some of those areas as we move forward. So what are some of the things to consider when making the determination as to whether or not an alert needs to be sent out? So Blaine, let's start with you. What are some of the key pieces that when you're trying to determine whether or not emergency notification needs to go out, whether a timely warning goes out? We know that we talked a little bit about the differences between the two. What are some things to consider when trying to figure out who is best equipped to send that message?
Sure, thanks, Abby. And I think that it's important when you're crafting these policies and practices related to both timely warnings and emergency notifications, it's important to think about how are you going to accomplish that requirement without delay and in a timely manner. So the without delay language comes directly from the emergency notification requirements. And timely is obviously what we have as part of these timely warnings. And timely it's a tough word. It's a lawyer word. It's a word that is only answerable or definable by your audience. And so the question is what do reasonable people think that timely is? So sometimes the threshold I use there is would you feel comfortable with this being scrutinized in the newspaper as to whether or not it was timely? So you got to have systems in place that allow you to do that. And those have to be built ahead of time with things like templates that allow all those stakeholders to have comfort that this isn't going to be spam that's sent out, but is actually related to these very serious requirements. I would tell you, with different institutions, I've seen challenges they faced. A number of institutions I've seen where they wanted to go through their marketing and communications folks, sometimes to put what I call a logo and theme music on top of it. That's great, but have them help you develop the template. Don't necessarily have them be the sender, because when you need to send a timely warning at 2 o'clock in the morning, those people can be very difficult to get on the phone. Same thing if your president is involved in sending out a timely warning or emergency notification. To me, that just adds sort of unacceptable or undue delays and makes it very hard to argue that it was timely when you had to track down the president at whatever lunch they were speaking at that day. So you really want to think about how you get policies and templates in place that everybody is comfortable with on your campus, and then allows those individuals that have the expertise and the information at that point the ability to send them out. We're a little bit separated in the way that we do it here. So me and my staff are involved in sending out timely warnings usually, although we have a number of backup individuals capable of doing that. Our emergency notifications for a first wave will generally come from our police dispatch center, but even that was a difficult decision for us. One thing to think about for those of you that say, oh, well, our dispatch is going to do it, is what's going to happen the first time that some incident is taking place on your campus, that there's a man with a gun, there's a shooting, that dispatch center is going to be overloaded with phone calls, hundreds of them likely. They're also likely going to be managing radio traffic for both officers and medical and fire. And so you really have to think hard about how you can build systems to put in place to make it as streamlined as possible. One of the things we did on our campus is we have a big red easy button in our dispatch center that can lock down the campus with just a single push. What happens when that button is pushed is it simultaneously triggers an emergency alert message that goes to the population and says, the campus is under a security lockdown, shelter in place, and await additional information. So that immediately tells people something's going on and I need to take some steps to protect myself, and allows us to figure out what we're dealing with and share that information via follow-up messages in short order. So those are just some of the things that we've done to make sure that we really do have a timely process, that there aren't too many hands touching this, alerts or timely warnings as they go.
Right, and I think that's a really great point. And I think it goes back to some of what we were seeing in terms of people's answers, that it's not to say that you shouldn't have that kind of multidisciplinary approach, or kind of as you were mentioning, I always love that comment about logo and theme music. We want to make sure that all of our communications certainly represent the institution to the best of its ability, but there are ways to be able to do that, and we're going to explore that a little bit further as the conversation goes on, as we look at templates or how we can have some of these conversations or do some test runs in advance so that we feel as though we're prepared. Anton, I know that that was something that you said initially, that for all of these things, when we're thinking about how we respond when cases may occur within our campus community, they're conversations that we want to have in advance as opposed to after the fact, and I really appreciated that. Anton, can you share a little bit about what that process looked like for you and how you determined where the message should come from on your campus?
Yeah, so at our university, which is a large public university, it was determined rather quickly that since the police department has a dispatch center and is also 24/7 capable, that the police department would be best placed to issue timely warnings and emergency notification. One reason being that, simply put, we have the staffing for it, one, and two, that it's only really law enforcement officers that are best prepared to determine whether or not the threat was serious or ongoing. And because of that, the university police department always makes that notification. We have a manager on call who carries a pager and a phone, and who all of our managers on call are as to what a timely warning is and why it should be issued, and also Clery staff are in communication with that manager to make sure that warning goes out. However, and we have this fail-safe that if the Clery manager can't be contacted, or for another reason, another university official can be contacted, our policy states very clearly that the police manager on call is fully equipped and capable to issue that warning on her own volition.
Right. And, I'll kind of reiterate that language that you just went back to, because I think it reinforces some of what we talked about a little bit earlier. As you said, the policy states very clearly. And remember that your policy is going to drive all of these other actions. I also recognize, too, that even though we're talking about, a certain type of resources and structures for two particular campuses, that every institution is incredibly different. So that's going to be something to consider as well. What is the size and the structure of your particular campus? You might be one that does not necessarily have campus police or security. So you'll want to consider in terms of, we know that these requirements apply to us regardless of what our size or our structure is, but that also means that we're best equipped to know our campus community and who might be in a position to send. Who's likely to be doing the responding, who may not have the bandwidth to be initiating and disseminating this information. Who else might be in a really good position, though, to be able to do that. So it all goes back to, and this is something, kind of a theme that you'll hear over and over, that it really will always go back to that particular policy. And so you want to think about, are there any areas of our policy that could create barriers to disseminating the information in a timely manner? So you want to think about, if we're spending time for it to go to this person and this person and then this person and this person in order for it to be approved, chances are you're probably adding some additional time there that may prevent the information from being timely in a matter of timely warning. So something to think about in terms of that.
And Abby, if I could just add one thing, again, this is Blaine. That whole question about the size and structure and type of campus really does make a difference. I mean, for those of us that are large metropolitan or public institutions, we oftentimes do these quite a bit. We've done 3 here in the last month. And so we have a lot of practice in how we execute on game day, for an example. But for smaller institutions or institutions that don't necessarily fit that more active profile, they may do these very sparingly. And so what's really important in that case is for institutions to practice this and drill on it and make sure that those people that are going to be responsible for doing it, for example, that their remote desktop access from home hasn't expired in the last 6 months and now they're not able to do what they need. So it's really important, I think, for institutions that in particular that don't do a lot of this to make sure that they're practicing well-oiled machine.
And I'm noticing some comments come in, especially for those of you that may be new to this, or for some of you that could be overwhelmed with some of this information. Some of what I'm seeing or hearing is, this is why I'm trying to access these types of webinars, to try to figure out what it is that I need to do. And I know right now there tends to be a national narrative of we've got to throw in all of this money in a certain place in order to be able to do this well. So one of the goals of National Campus Safety Awareness Month and around the campaign that we do for NACSAM is really making sure that you're aware that there are a lot of free resources that can help guide these conversations and give you information. So a couple of those resources that are available through NACSAM, but then also there are some others that are available on other websites as well, are things like the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting that really walks through all of the Clery requirements and gives some examples and samples of things that you should consider. And then we also have documents that we've created for National Campus Safety Awareness Month that are available for free in terms of what's the information that goes in your annual security report, or what's a checklist that I need to think about with timely warnings and emergency notification. So it certainly does take attention and care on your campus, but there are also a lot of free resources that are out there that can help support you in that work, and that's really a role that the Clery Center is committed to playing, is to be able to support you in that way. So as we go through and as you have questions, if there are still lingering questions at the end or things that are more campus specific that you want to reach out about, we will certainly have our contact information at the end so that you can also follow up more directly one-on-one. So going back to, one of the things that Blaine just recently said was we really want to take a look at in advance, what are we crafting, what are some of the things that we need to look at, not just in terms of are our systems working, which is certainly important, but in terms of content. If we have an incident that occurs within our campus community, what is the information that we would want to share? It's something that we don't want to have to draft on the spot. There are a lot of times there's language and things that we can prepare ahead of time to help the institution be better prepared in that moment. So outside of drafting policies and procedures, we have that real issue of what content should be included within the alerts. And again, as we mentioned, it's a little bit different for timely warnings and emergency notification. We know that timely warnings are disseminated to all of that, what's known as Clery geography. It's disseminated to the campus community for the serious and ongoing threats, and they're tied to Clery crimes, whereas emergency notification is broader. It could be something like a fire, it could be something like an earthquake or a gas leak. So it's something to consider in terms of if we were having these types of emergencies or these types of crimes within our community, what are some key things that we should be paying attention to? So I'll start with Blaine. In terms of drafting content, what are some of the key things? I know that you work with institutions all across the country as well. What are some of the key questions that you're hearing in the field regarding drafting that content?
Thanks, Abby. I think not necessarily questions, but hearing success stories from institutions that have been really successful by drafting flexible templates. And so I'll start with timely warnings and I'll finish with emergency notifications. But on the timely warning side, we have a standardized template that, if you remember from math class, is sort of plug and chug, that you can put in your incident information, you plug in your suspect information if you have any that's relevant or you have any that has been provided. And then the rest of the timely warning is really a canned template. One thing I did want to mention is that something we've recently taken steps to do and that I've seen as a real promising or best practice around the country is really looking at the language in your timely warning templates about the resources that are available and the services available on campus. We've tried to make our template much more victim-focused and victim-supporting. We've seen some good examples from institutions like the University of Oregon who've done that as well. And I would recommend that as an emerging best practice or a promising practice. But other than that, our template requires very little input, sort of just the facts about what has been involved in that incident. We get the relevant facts that we have, and we get that timely warning out the door as quickly as we can. On the emergency notification side, most of you are using text alert systems of some kind. And there's a lot of different vendors out there, but they all generally do the same type of thing, and that's blast a text message out to a large population. One of the things people often don't think about is you're limited in those to 140 characters, and those characters include spaces. So when I teach classes on the Clery Act in person, I'll often have participants go through a timed exercise of giving them a scenario and trying to get them to write a 140 character message that gives the information that's needed. And that's really challenging for folks to do, especially when there's lives on the line. So the best thing that I can recommend is most of those, at least I know ours does, those text messaging systems have the ability to build templates in them. And so we have one built for tornadoes, we have one built for active shooter, we have one built for bomb threat. And then again, it's just a matter of going in there and plugging in sort of the pertinent information that's available at that time and moving that emergency notification out the door.
Right, and I know, one thing that we also want to note and acknowledge is that we may not be able to prepare for every type of emergency that might occur. So that doesn't mean certainly that a template is fail-safe, but it does mean that it gives you an opportunity to explore and think about some of these things, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in just a moment, such as language, or how do we make sure that we're providing supportive language to a survivor while also providing information that can help protect the campus community. So Anton, I'd just love for you to speak on that a little bit in terms of drafting content. What are some of the things that you've been hearing in the field in terms of consistency or in terms of the way that information is drafted?
Sure, Abby. Well, there have been a number of topics that we discuss internally within the university, within the Big Ten and other partners of ours, and one of the topics that we discuss is race and whether or not to include a racial description as part of a timely warning. And the decision that our university has come to is we would only include race if it's part of a broader description of a suspect in that timely warning. So in other words, that if it was a Hispanic male that we are on the lookout for committing a robbery, for example, we wouldn't just put out, Hispanic male. We would only include that if there was a further description, Hispanic male wearing, I don't know, a red T-shirt with blue pants, something to that effect, because, of course, the purpose of a timely warning is to protect the campus, and the campus can't be protected if it's looking out for, well, frankly, every Hispanic male. That's not very helpful at all. We have to include some context for that, and I think the community, by and large, appreciates when we give that context and when we are being consistent in our descriptions, our suspect descriptions, and also we make sure to protect the identity of our victims of violence, specifically when we're talking about sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and stalking that the Clery Act specifically focuses on. And in those cases, we want to make sure that the timely warnings that are issued do not lead to an identification of the victim. For example, if we're talking about a residence hall that maybe houses 50 students, it would be very dangerous to include a description of a victim of that sexual assault if a sexual assault was to happen in that residence hall, for example, saying that an Asian female reported that a sexual assault was committed against her in Johnson Hall, when Johnson Hall holds 50 students, and one can easily deduce which one of the, for example, 4 Asian females that live in the hall that may be the victim of the crime. We want to make sure we're protecting victims of sensitive crime specifically. So in that case, we would describe the location in question as, in University of Wisconsin-Madison's example, as a lakeshore dorm, for example, which is a number of dorms on the lakeshore, instead of talking about this hypothetical Johnson dorm specifically.
Right, and the practice that we've seen quite a bit is institutions, if possible, being able to work with the victim or talk to the victim about what information is identifiable. And you made an important point regarding how do we protect the confidentiality of the victim or of the survivor in these cases as we're also sharing information about a specific crime with the campus community. And that was one of the new pieces with the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act. There's now specific language that must be within your annual security reports, within your policies, that really addresses how you're going to provide confidentiality in that publicly available information. So that timely warning, daily crime log, the information that you share publicly shouldn't be identifying an individual. So it's just something to think about in terms of how have we thought through some of these different scenarios, and particularly a number of these different issues, whether we're talking about whether to include race in a timely warning, whether we're talking about what type of language to provide in terms of prevention, whether we're talking about specific types of crimes. Have we had this conversation with the teams that you mentioned when we talked about kind of who's at the table for this process? Have we considered not just the different types of crimes that could occur, but all of these different layers that might impact our campus community, and how can we be sensitive to making sure that the information is most helpful and most useful? Sometimes that also involves bringing the campus community or members of the campus community to the table. So if they have questions, if they have concerns as to why information is being sent out, really figuring out how can we engage in a productive conversation around that, which certainly we've seen at the University of Wisconsin. So before we move on to our next layer, just some things to think about. Looking at templates, having that consistency, and then another question that came in through a number of different people in different formats was in terms of dissemination. You know, how are we sending these messages? Is it okay to send through social media? Is it okay to send through text message? Is it okay to send through email? The goal is that in your policies you're really outlining what are our methods of dissemination, and we always really encourage a multimodal approach because we know that technology can sometimes be our friend or sometimes it cannot be. So do you have different methods for being able to send out that information if you would have a problem? And also we really being clear about which method we use for these types of messages. So the law is not prescriptive in terms of how you're sharing the information, but it is prescriptive in that you are sharing the information and getting it out there in these particular situations or scenarios. So I want to go back to a little bit about what you were talking about, Anton, which is really, and Blaine brought this up a little bit earlier, which is the language that we're using in timely warnings. And I want to talk more specifically about campus sexual assault because it's a topic that we're seeing certainly within the media. The White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault has been focusing on this issue publicly. So it's an area where a lot of people have been trying to figure out what is the best way that we communicate with our campus community. And we get a lot of questions regarding issuing warnings. And Anton, I know that you recently had some media attention around that issue in particular. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just sharing some of your experience around campus sexual assault and timely warnings.
Sure. Last academic year, we have a blog on our police website, and we published an article by an officer, and the subject being basically how students should protect themselves from crimes committed by strangers in the community, and a particular focus on basically robberies and thefts and folks kind of not looking up from the ground or walking while intoxicated, things like that, and making sure to kind of take your earbuds out, things like that. Well, unfortunately, the article, the blog post, was not clear in the focus, and a lot of students and other campus staff and faculty took the article to be a victim-blaming exercise against victims of sexual assault specifically, because the article was perceived by folks as to be about sexual assault in particular, even though those words were nowhere to be found in the article. Of course, there's a history of victims of sexual assault being blamed for various actions that aren't really connected with sexual assault at all. So it's understandable why some folks took that article that way, especially with, we know that sexual assault on campus is everywhere in the media, and a lot of folks are taking all sorts of security articles with that specific lens in mind. After we had that very unfortunate incident with with that media attention and campus attention to the police department in particular, we decided to take a very conscious effort to have a conversation with campus about what we can do. And we tied in timely warnings in that conversation. And I initiated meetings with campus partners, so Dean of Students Office, University Housing, so professional staff members at the university, but also we met with groups of students from our campus rape crisis center, our external rape crisis center, our university health services, and also groups of students and individual students unconnected with any formal organization to talk about how we can improve timely warnings and what they would like to see. And the overwhelming message from them, from those students, from our campus professionals, and from kind of professionals in the field of sexual violence generally, was that it's important to focus on the perpetrators of sexual violence instead of the victims of sexual violence, specifically in timely warnings. And so we came up with a list of prevention tips that you can find actually as part of the list of handouts on the right pane in this webinar. And those prevention tips are integrated into our timely warnings going forward, including the one you see in front of you. Some of them were integrated then, although we've improved the list substantially since April when this particular timely warning was put out. And Upworthy, which is a kind of a well-read blog, put out an article about how UW-Madison basically takes sexual violence seriously and puts out timely warnings that are useful, which we were obviously very grateful for and very happy about.
Right. And I think one of the things that you said that I really kind of took away from that last section is you talked about the perception was that we did not care, or not that we didn't care, but that we were victim blaming. And so I think that perception piece is really important, because what that narrative or what that story really shows to me is how that perception can change when you have the right people at the table. Because it wasn't necessarily a matter of having uncaring people at the table initially, but it was a matter of maybe you needed some additional perspectives. And I think that that's something that we see quite a bit. You know, certainly at our trainings, we hear a lot of conversation where there might be individuals or activists that don't understand why someone in law enforcement would want to use certain language. There may be folks in law enforcement that are being really specific about language for certain reasons. And there needs to be a space and a time to really talk those through at a time where there's not an emergency happening on the campus. So what I most love about that story, other than, you know, really giving some practical examples of how can we think about the bystander piece and really use timely warnings as a prevention tool on our campus, is it also shows the positive effects of really looking at who has knowledge and expertise around this area and who might be a part of this process that we wouldn't traditionally think would be involved in crafting timely warnings. One of the things that we've seen quite a bit in terms of Clery and its evolutions is people used to really look at this as this is a campus police, campus security law. This is only related to that particular department. But what we see, especially throughout the law itself, is that it overlaps with a number of different departments. And so having those different perspectives and having a space to talk through those different perspectives ahead of time is incredibly useful. So some things to think about, and then some general takeaways before we go on to questions that were coming in during the session. And now is also a good time if you have other questions that you wanted to pose to the Clery Center or to Anton, to Blaine, we can address those now as well. So one is to have those campus conversations and to think about, you know, one of the things that comes up quite a bit in our conversations with institutions goes back to what you said about perception, is sometimes we will have people reach out to us and say, you know, we're getting really pushback on why did we send out a timely warning in this area? Why did we not send out a timely warning in this area? And it goes back to, do we have a policy that we have confidence in, that we have brought multiple people to the table to develop? And then also, are there things in terms of that conversation that we should be paying attention to? So if the language could be clearer, if there are ways that we could be pulling from other expertise and informing the work that we do, there may be an opportunity to do that. So that speaks to that second question of what are you hearing from your community? Is the language that you're reflecting in the alerts that you're sending really reflective of that campus community and of their needs? So really taking the time to look at that and to start that conversation if it hasn't happened already. The other point that I want to make that we haven't acknowledged as much, but I think it's important to address, especially in terms of campus sexual assault, is one of the themes that we've been hearing are institutions that believe that when it comes to campus sexual assault, an institution has to send out a timely warning every single time a sexual assault occurs within their Clery geography. And with sexual assault, as with all other Clery crimes, what the Department of Education calls for is that the institution makes a case-by-case analysis as to whether or not there was a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. Now, one thing to consider in that area, and where we have seen concerns or questions in program reviews, is that you want to make sure that you're documenting these decisions, because if we go back to the example that Blaine gave at the very beginning of this webinar, there are probably a lot of different reasons why you may or may not choose to put out a timely warning. So if, for example, there's a scenario where the suspect has been apprehended, where there is not a threat to your campus community, or a number of other different factors that would cause you and the experts making these decisions to determine that there's not a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community, you want to make sure that you have a process for documenting that information, so that instead of believing that you have to send a warning out every single time, you know that you have an intentional process for making that case-by-case analysis, which is what is called for under the Clery Act and under the law itself. So in addition to these takeaways, just going by some of the questions that we've been having coming in during the session, some things to think about is, first, do we have a timely warning policy? Do we have an emergency notification policy? Do they have the information that we need? If not, as I mentioned, we have a checklist that will help walk you through some of those pieces that are required under the law, and you can access that. Again, all of our National Campus Safety Awareness Month resources on those pages are free, and I know that that link has been put in the control panel, so you can access it through that way. And then also, once you start asking those questions of do we have a policy, then you can explore some of those other questions, such as who was at the table when we drafted them. Once we have this policy in place, do we have templates that we're going to be able to use? Have we asked some of the questions that may come up if and when a crime occurs in our campus community? Have we addressed that ahead of time, so that if and when, hopefully, the crime doesn't occur, hopefully the emergency doesn't occur, but if it does, we feel confident in our policies and in our process. Because as I say, one of the things that we see on a regular basis, unfortunately, is that so often people undermine their own knowledge and expertise, and they undermine all of the kind of hard work and attention that they put in to crafting policies that they really thought would best support their campus community. In addition to that, I'm just going to look at some of the other questions that I'm seeing coming in. One was, should local law enforcement be involved in the process when you're looking at policies? So I'm going to ask Blaine, have you had any experience, or have you seen any experience in the work that you've done with campuses bringing in local law enforcement when they're making some of those initial decisions?
Sure, that's a very sticky wicket. That's a difficult one that I think a number of campuses are struggling with. I think obviously if your campus does not have sworn law enforcement that's campus specific, you absolutely need to have local law enforcement involved, because likely they're going to be the responding agency to any type of incident that's happening, say for example on your public property. And I guess the question would be, does your security office monitor their radio channels? Do they do like a co-response to those types of incidents? For campuses with law enforcement, I've seen it all over the board. I've seen where there's horrible relationships between the local city law enforcement and the university law enforcement. I've seen great relationships. But certainly I think it's important for institutions to, it's incumbent upon institutions to work with local law enforcement to make them aware of the requirements under federal law. And there are some good examples, not good examples, but examples you can learn from out there, even in some of the reviews and resolution agreements, for example, related to Title IX. And an example that comes to mind for me would be Missoula, Montana. But there's a case where the institution and the local law enforcement really need to be able to work closely to make sure that these timely warning and emergency notification requirements are being met. If you have an incident that happens where there's a shooting 4 blocks off campus, it's not in your Clery reportable geography, and it's not even in your patrol jurisdiction, but the suspect with the gun is fleeing towards your campus, that's information that you want to be able to let your campus community know about through an emergency notification in order to help them stay safe.
Right, and I think one of the, and you made this point as well, and I just want to reinforce it, one of the other reasons why having the conversation with local law enforcement is important is because this is a campus requirement. Local law enforcement might not always have an understanding of why institutions are making the decisions that they are. So informing them of the requirement, talking about timely warning and how that information or emergency notifications and how this information can be sent out can be really critical in working with local law enforcement so that they understand that when information is being shared with the campus community, it is never to compromise an investigation, and you would certainly take steps to avoid compromising an investigation, but that you also are required to make the campus community aware of things that might impact their safety and security. So bringing them to the table, even if it's not always for the case-by-case decision-making, bringing them to the table for training and maybe even having them involved in your policy development can help make sure that you and anyone else that may be tasked with responding, even if you do have law enforcement on your own campus, if you would be partnering with them for any of these particular cases, as I imagine you would, having those conversations ahead of time can be really helpful or useful.
Abby, I'd also throw in there that similar conversations are important with your local district attorney, because oftentimes we've seen cases where the DA doesn't want any information released about a case and doesn't understand why we do these types of notifications. And so it's important as well, I think, to have them in the loop where you can.
Anton, I'm going to give you this other question that came in. It says, if you have a situation where you have the serious or ongoing threat and you issue a timely warning, as the situation plays out, how often would you recommend sending out updates, or would you send out updates? So I'd be interested to hear what your practice for that is.
So we would typically send out an update if one was appropriate within kind of the same time frame that we originally sent the timely warning for. So in other words, if I don't know, that there was, for example, a robbery that had just occurred, and we maybe discovered who the robber was or apprehended him or identified the suspect in another way and made the threat no longer serious or ongoing, if you will, I think we would issue out a warning in that situation. However, if the crime was solved or the threat was quelled in some other manner after a longer period of time, I don't know, we would probably not issue a warning, but we would probably publish something on the website, on our UW Police website, or a press release saying that, this situation has been resolved.
Right, and I think some of it goes back to, a lot of times people will look for, well, what does the language in the law say? But also some of what you may be considering is what's reasonable and helpful to your community. So a story that I've shared with training participants is I had a time recently when I was in an airport, an alarm started going off. They told no one to move, or they told everyone to stay put and not move. And we had to, they were giving us directions on how to respond and to stay put. And then after that, there was no information shared. And I was in the same airport for the next hour, 2 hours, and I never got a follow-up as to what the emergency was, whether it was contained, whether I still had a safety risk. And so that really goes back to me. It was something that I really reflected on as to why these requirements are in place. So something you might think about is if you were a member of your campus community that weren't involved in this process, would you still have concerns about your safety given the information that was shared? And if so, is it going to be helpful to give a follow-up, even just to let them know if something is contained or to let them know other information that might impact their safety? So some of it may be considering some of these pieces from a practical standpoint, in addition to all of these, these other questions that you're considering on a day-to-day basis. Now, it looks like we're nearing the end of our time. One of the questions that came in was, is this being recorded? I'm trying to write really fast, but I'll panic less if I know that I can go back to where there are holes. So just to remind you, yes, it is absolutely being recorded. For those of you who signed up for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, it's going to be linked to next week's email. We send out emails weekly as a part of the month. So if you've not signed up and you want to make sure that you have access to that recording, you can sign up using the link that we provided to you, and we'll make sure that you have access to that. You can also access this and other webinars that we've done. We have a number of different free ones that we're doing for this month and that we've done in the past, and those are loaded on the Clery Center's YouTube page. So that's another place that you can go for information. So I'm going to move it onto this page since we are at the end of our time together. This has contact information. If there were questions that we were unable to address within the space, you are more than welcome to send us an email, and we are happy to help connect you with additional resources or help you in any way that we can. Thank you again to Anton, Blaine, and to all of you for joining us. In your chat panel, you're going to see a link to an evaluation for today's webinar. We'd really appreciate it if you take just a few short minutes to share your thoughts and feedback. We always like to know what kind of content you'd like to see more of as we plan additional webinars throughout the year. This webinar was just one of several webinars for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, so if you'd like to sign up for some of the additional ones, they are on our website, and that webinar recording will be in next week's email blast for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. And as I mentioned, you can click on the link to register for those webinars or to sign up for those emails. We also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I know my colleague Amy has plugged in the hashtag that we've been using, NACSAM 2015, and you can follow us for daily campus safety information that you could also share with your campus community. In addition to that, you can visit our website to learn more about other training opportunities and learning resources, such as our Clery Center Collaborative Program, which is our team-based learning membership program that brings together colleges and universities to build sustainable approaches to campus safety and Clery Act compliance. So we're really fortunate to work with a number of different campus safety teams that are putting their focus and their attention around Clery compliance. And during the month of September, we're doing a 10% discount for the collaborative as part of National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So all of that information is available on the NACSAM pages and available through our website. So if you have any other questions, as I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us using the email on the screen. Our phone number is also listed. But in addition to that, just thank you so much for joining us all today, and we hope that you have a great afternoon.